Thank you, Mr. President, for the recognition, and thank you also for your excellent tribute to Senator Mark Andrews and his amazing life of service to North Dakota and to our country. Also, thank you for switching places with me for a few minutes so I can spend some time remembering my friend and mentor and our predecessor. You know, this COVID thing really kind of stinks. All in all, there's lots of things about COVID-19 that are awful. But one of the biggest things is that so often many people have been robbed of the opportunity to provide an appropriate send-off to a hero, to the heroes whose lives are worthy of a more noble celebration than social distancing and small crowds offer. As former Grand Forks Herald editor and publisher, and sometimes political commentator and observer Mike Jacobs recently wrote in the Grand Forks Herald, quote, "Mark Andrews deserves better." And I would ask unanimous consent to place the Jacobs story in the record along with the official obituaries of both Mark and Mary Andrews.
Without objection.
So we're confined to watching funerals on the internet, leaving us with a sense that our expressions of gratitude and emotions are inadequate to the honor that is deserved. But fortunately for Senator Hoeven and me, the United States Senate does provide an opportunity, a venue, an appropriate way to say goodbye to a friend and a mentor that's commensurate with the incredible quality of the life that we celebrate. Senator Andrews was a giant to me for lots of reasons, not just because he was 6'4", but from growing up in Kindred, just about 20 miles south of the Andrews farm, just outside of the city village of Mapleton at the time, to working on his re-election campaign, the first real job I ever had out of college, to seeking his guidance as I followed in his footsteps, first in the House of Representatives and then into the Senate. Mark Andrews was always a larger-than-life figure and personality to me. Chris and I were grateful for the counsel that he and Mary gave us in my first year in this chamber just last year, and I'm really grateful to Mark and Mary's daughter, Sarah, for facilitating a visit for Chris and me to come and see her parents just last year. And this picture will be important to me forever. It was an emotional time for me. I don't mind telling you. It was emotional for me to be able to go see Mark at the age of 93, Mary at the age of 92, and say thank you for the opportunities, for the grace that he afforded me when I didn't deserve it. And I mean no disrespect to any of my colleagues today, but what made me the most emotional when I walked into Mark's apartment and saw him sitting in that recliner, the thing that made me the most emotional was that it hit me for the first time in a new way, that the people of North Dakota had given me a responsibility that at that time, as I looked at my giant, I didn't feel quite up to. And there I was with this job that he had, and this giant from my youth who did big things. I suddenly felt by comparison quite small. But, as Mark often did, he encouraged me. He offered a word of encouragement, many of them. And likewise, Mary did the same. At the age of 92 with Chris, she offered Chris an encouragement that only another Senate spouse really had the credibility to offer. And I was overwhelmed by the blessing of the moment. I was grateful beyond words for the opportunity to spend even 90 minutes with Fargo's most important power couple. You know, it was pretty cool. Mark and Mary celebrated their 71st wedding anniversary just prior to her death earlier this year, as Senator Hoeven mentioned. They met while attending Agassiz Junior High in Fargo in 1939. And then they became best friends for life. Pretty cool, pretty cool. And I love that Mary Andrews was her husband's not-so-secret weapon in all of his successful campaigns. As you said, Mr. President, Mark served a total of 23 years in Congress, 17 in the House of Representatives and 6 here in the Senate. His hallmark was his fierce independence. Now, that fierce independence sometimes was to the chagrin of the Reagan administration. He served during a very, very difficult time in farm country But he fought tirelessly with the government on behalf of the people. He always put the people ahead of the government. And anyone, as you mentioned, anyone who spent any time with Mark, and you and I did a lot in these last several years, Mr. President, you know that no computer hard drive in the world contains as much knowledge or information about water policy than Mark Andrews had in his brain, even to the end. I mean, of the 90 minutes we talked last year, I'm sure 60 of it was spent talking about water policy and water politics. He was passionate about the accomplishments, as you said, and the shortcomings of the government's promise to distribute Missouri River water to the farms and communities of eastern North Dakota. He fought and advocated for water justice for our farmers, and I think of him often as we engage in the very same fights today. He was also a strong critic of government waste. And while you're right, he supported our military fiercely. I mean, there was one famous story about when he opposed the sale of the AWACS to Saudi Arabia on behalf of our ally Israel, and it took a lot of shall we say, gentle persuasion to convince him otherwise. But he always looked out for the taxpayer. He cared more about the taxpayer than the tax spender. He demonstrated his commitment to fiscal restraint when he took on the Department of Defense in 1983, sponsoring a bill requiring defense contractors to guarantee their hardware. The bill passed and became law. He was also critical of what he called the incestuous relationship between the officers who made the weapons purchase decisions and the contractors who employed the officers after they retired. But as you pointed out in your remarks, Mr. President, Mark Andrews was first and foremost a farmer. But don't take our word for it. It's not just a couple of hayseeds from North Dakota that would make that claim. No, just look at the headlines surrounding his recent death. The New York Times, in an obituary written by Robert McFadden, carries the headline, quote, "Mark Andrews, North Dakota farmer / politician, dies at 94. Did you catch that? Farmer first, the dash of life, politician last. McFadden writes this in his story, quote, "As his 23-year congressional career drew to a close, the New York Times said Mr. Andrews had kept, quote, 3 items at the top of his priority list." A lot like you, I might say, Mr. President. Farmers, farmers, and farmers. That headline for a story written by Mikkel Pates, a friend of ours, reporter, excellent agricultural reporter. He wrote this in Ag Week. He described Senator Andrews' legacy perfectly in the headline. Quote, "Andrews was a political laser beam for farm interests." And I would seek unanimous consent to place both the Ag Week and the New York Times stories in the record.
Without objection.
So farmer, fiercely independent, fiscal hawk, all of the good things that you described about him, Mr. President, they describe a part of Senator Mark Andrews, but to me, he's still a giant. At his funeral, the gospel text that was read was from an agrarian parable in Matthew 13, very familiar one to most people, where Jesus talks about the teeny mustard seed, right? And in verse 32, he's recorded as saying, "Though it is the smallest of all seeds, yet when it grows, it is the largest of garden plants and becomes a tree, so that birds can come and perch in its branches." Mark Andrews was a really big tree with really deep roots into the soil of the Red River Valley of North Dakota. And I felt as though I had found a perch on his branches and stand on his shoulders. But Mark and Mary also died with the gospel promise that Christ has prepared a mansion for them in heaven. I'm pretty sure it's a farmhouse. Thank you, Senator Andrews. You served North Dakota well and will be missed. I yield the floor.